Welcome back to the slow read of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So where are we now? We're in book 3. We're doing the second part. The first part of book 3 was quite a dense bit where there were a lot of distinctions, mainly between voluntary and involuntary acts, but also a little bit on non-voluntary. Remember, the important difference here is that voluntary acts are done knowingly and that they proceed from the agent. That's how Aristotle goes on to define choice as something which is chosen knowingly and for its own sake. Okay, and now he goes on to discuss different virtues and give us examples of these virtues to explain what they are. Remember the definition of virtue from earlier on, because these examples of specific virtues will explain exactly what this definition means. So we have the definition of virtue as a purposive disposition. So purposive means done on purpose, and this relates to the whole discussion about choice. It's chosen knowingly and for its own sake. A disposition, this is a character trait that is stable. It is long-lasting, it is reliable, it is the kind of thing that you can expect to see manifested in all sorts of different situations. Okay, so it's a purposive disposition lying in a mean. Remember, the doctrine of the mean is a doctrine of appropriateness, doing the right kind of thing at the right time, towards the right people, in the right way, and with the right emotion. And you can go wrong in two ways: too much or too little. Both the excess and the deficiency is a vice. So purposive disposition, lying in a mean and determined by the right reason. The right reason goes back to the function argument. The function of human beings is to reason. Therefore, an excellent life is a life which perceives the demands of reason. The right reason gives you the answer as to what should happen in this particular case. So it's determined, virtue is determined. The right thing to do is determined by the right reason and by what the virtuous agent would use to determine it. The it here is the right reason. Yeah? The virtuous person doesn't make up the content of virtue because of what he does. Rather, he instantiates virtue because he can perceive the right reason. These are the moral qualities that he has, qualities that allow him to perceive the right reason. That's why you look to the right, to the virtuous agent. But okay. More about that coming later chapters. What we have now is an account of different virtues. To be honest, this bit reads a little bit easier, so this part of the book is a bit of a breather. I think it's slightly easier to follow, but it is quite detailed and gives a lot of information about each virtue. So we'll just do courage this time, and then we'll move on to temperance, which is the next virtue he considers. So, what is the subject matter of courage? Sorry. Aristotle is quite interested in finding the particular focus of each virtue. Now that might be quite surprising to you. So the best thing would be to forget what you think courage is and just look at Aristotle's account of courage. I'm really going to choke myself. And really look at Aristotle's account of courage as a technical account of courage. So he needs to focus each virtue on its particular sphere of influence. And he starts off the discussion of courage by telling us things that courage is not. It is not concerned with other things. So it is concerned with fear and confidence. But there are many things that we fear. We fear all sorts of fearful and evil things. But the sphere of courage is not all fearful and evil things. He narrows it down. For example, he says, we fear disgrace. That is a fearful thing. But this is not the object of courage, because it is something which is always shameful. You should always be ashamed when you fall into disgrace. To not fear disgrace is to be shameless. It's a completely different vice from the vice of rashness. Or, for example, to not fear poverty. That is not an example of courage, but is an example of liberality, the virtue that is concerned with distribution of wealth. So he'll come to talk about liberality, for example, later on. But for now, he needs to find what is the subject matter of courage with respect to fear and confidence rather than other things. So he starts thinking about it by asking, what is the most fearful thing? And death seems to be the greatest terror. So could that be the object of courage? Now that can't be it, he says, because death at sea, for example, or from illness, doesn't allow the scope for displaying courage. What he means here is the kind of situation where you don't have any choices. If your ship is being overwhelmed by a storm and you're about to drown to death, there isn't anything left for you to display. There are no actions here, there are no choices here. So if virtue is a purpose of disposition concerned with choice, then there is no choice, therefore there can't be any virtue. So courage has to be something, reaction to fear and confidence, that is displayed in noble circumstances. There has to be circumstances that allow you to act in a particular way, so that your acts express the virtue of courage and have the quality of that virtue. So he argues that the noblest type of death is death in war. Now this is just an example. He doesn't mean to narrow the virtue of courage just to situations of war. He's giving an example of the possibility of death being noble, and presumably there could be other situations where to choose death would be a noble and courageous choice. Now, why is it noble? It is noble because you're doing something honourable in war, and therefore there is scope for you to display courage in choosing the noble end. Okay, so choice is very significant in how he understands virtue. Immediately he gives an example of a noble choice with respect to courage, and this is the seaman who doesn't give up for the possibility of rescue because he's aware of all possibilities and what might happen. Okay. So here it is the seaman's knowledge that makes him understand that there are other options and there are other choices, and that is what helps him to avoid despair. Or being brave in the face of the outbreak of a disease, because there are still choices. This is not about somebody who's been overwhelmed by the disease and is about to die, but facing choices what to do at a time of an outbreak of a disease. All these kinds of situations are important because they give scope for action, and a specific kind of action with respect to fear and confidence, action that shows either strong resistance or glorious death. Okay, so you either stand strong in the face of these fears, or as you act, you may die, but you do so for a glorious end, not just for anything, but for something that contributes to the noble and the good. Okay, then he goes back to discussing the mean as a doctrine of appropriateness. There is a really useful paragraph where again he summarizes a lot of the things that he said earlier on. What is fearful is relative to the individual. What might be fearful for one person might not be fearful for another. So you can't say in advance of knowing the person whether that particular situation will be a situation in which they can display courage in. That courage is not involved with being fearless, having no fear at all, but with being fearful in the right way. Remember, he has said about all the virtues that they are an expression of the right thing in the right way. So the right way is not too much and not too little, just the correct amount. And then he repeats again this idea that we can go wrong in many ways. We can go wrong by fearing the wrong thing. So the object of our fear is the wrong thing, it's just not a fearful thing. Or in the wrong way. Yeah, we're fearful in ways that are perhaps exhibiting other vices, or at the wrong time. Okay. Courage is itself noble because it is a virtue, and its end is noble because the nature of the thing is determined by its end. This is a really important couple of sentences here, because we can draw the conclusion that Aristotle doesn't think that you are courageous if your end is not noble. So we might say, when we speak commonsensically, that perhaps a thief was very courageous because he had the audacity to rob a bank in broad daylight and get away with it, and there's so much police surrounding him. And that kind of seems commonsensically like a courageous thing. But for Aristotle, this is not a display of courage as a virtue. Remember, we're talking about a technical term when we say courage as a virtue, and not how we speak commonsensically. And why is not this the virtue of courage? Because of what the thief was aiming at. The thief was aiming to steal, to defraud, to do an unjust act. Therefore, that cannot be a courageous thing if the end is not noble. It is only when the end is noble that it determines that the way of getting to the end is also worthwhile. Okay? Courage cannot aim at things that are in themselves evil or vicious and still be courage. That is simply a colloquial way of talking about courage and not the virtue of courage. Okay, then he talks a little bit about the vices. Remember, the vices with respect to fear and confidence are the vice of excessive fear, cowardice, and the vice of deficient fear, rashness. So first he says that if you fear absolutely nothing, this can't be the vice of rashness. You're just an insensitive person. You're not affected by anything at all. But probably rashness is to have too much confidence with things that are fearful, not to truly see the aspect in which they are truly fearful, but to be overconfident with respect to those things. And the rash is in this way a pretender to courage. The rash might be somebody who appears courageous to others because of the lack of fear. But we should still notice that he gets it wrong, and to get it wrong cannot be a virtue. He gets it wrong because he's overconfident. He doesn't recognize the appropriate amount of fear in this particular situation, which requires fear. And Aristotle also thinks that if you're rash in a particular situation, overconfident, we should also expect you to get it wrong in other situations. And it might be very likely that you are a coward in other situations because of your failure to understand what is appropriate. So it is possible that you move between these two vices exactly because you haven't understood what the right response is when you are a rash person. Now, an excessive fear is cowardice, and this can be associated with a general feeling of despondence because you fear absolutely everything. And then he goes on to just repeat the importance of the doctrine of the mean, and he argues that it is courageous to endure hardship. So, for example, when you endure hardship because of poverty or unrequited love or physical suffering because of an illness, all of that is courageous, but it is a weakness to want to escape all this through suicide because of the end of suicide. So the end of suicide is death, and death is always the end of choice and agency. So if you're aiming at death to avoid these kinds of things like poverty and unrequited love, heartache, or perhaps physical pain and mental anguish because of an illness, and you're aiming at death for these reasons, and death is the end of agency, then that is not a noble end, and therefore it cannot illuminate the actions that you take to reach to it. Okay? Therefore you cannot be courageous if for those reasons you want death. Okay, that's just a sentence he says there about suicide, but it's an interesting sentence. Then he goes on to talk about 5 different dispositions that resemble courage. So first we have civic courage. He says that this is very close to courage, but it is not actual courage because it doesn't aim at the noble. It is rather motivated by civic responsibilities, by feelings like shame from not doing what is needed by your city, or the desire to gain honours where what you do is acknowledged by other citizens, or the desire to escape penalties that have been imposed by other citizens for those who forfeit their civic responsibilities. But it is nonetheless very close to courage. But courage has to be aiming at the noble and the good, not these other things. Okay. And he clarifies an idea here, that acting under compulsion doesn't make you courageous. Now we should of course expect him to say that, If the soldiers are running into battle because the general is standing behind them and is threatening to shoot them if they don't, then that's not a display of courage, because the act has been forced by an external force that is making you act in this particular way. So compulsion can never be the kind of thing that motivates true courage, the virtue of courage. You have to be courageous because you recognize the noble and the good. The second disposition that resembles courage is the experience of risk. So some people in some situations are better judges of how risky the situation is. So for example, a seasoned soldier faced with an alarm just before battle would be better able to understand whether this is a false alarm or an actual situation that requires action. Because of this understanding of the elements of risk and how risky a situation might be, the person who has this knowledge may appear more courageous because they know it's a false alarm. They don't react to it, and therefore they appear more at ease with the fear inherent in the situation of an alarm before battle. But all this is elusive, of course, because it is just the knowledge that they have that gives them this response, right? They appear brave, but they're not actually brave. The only reason the others appear cowardly is because they don't know how groundless their beliefs are. And we know because of the doctrine of the me that you have to have the right reason. You need to have knowledge and understanding of what is happening in the situation in order to be truly virtuous. Spirit. Now, spirit is being bold in the face of danger in the same way that an animal would be full of spirit in the face of danger. Now, courageous people act for a fine motive, and it might be that spirit is an accessory. It helps them. This kind of natural, spirited response to fear may be something that helps courageous people act in a courageous manner. Remember, in Virtue Ethics, Aristotle has a long developmental picture with many elements going towards the development of virtue, towards becoming virtuous. So spirit could be one of the things that help with the development or the practice of the virtue of courage. But courage can't be spirit alone. An injured animal, a frightened animal, shows spirit because of the pain or because of the anger that it is feeling in that particular situation. And it is the feeling alone that pushes them to be spirited. And that cannot be a virtue. It is an overwhelming feeling that leads to the action rather than a purposive disposition in accordance with the right reason. That's why spirit is not courage. Optimism. A general feeling everything will go well, just generally being positive about everything. And he gives an example of why people might be optimistic. If they've had previous successes, they may be filled with self-confidence in themselves because of that and be quite certain that they're going to have future successes. But this, Aristotle says, is an incorrect belief. Just because things went well for you in the past doesn't mean they will do so in the future. So if you have this kind of incorrect belief that is based on fake self-confidence that leads you to be optimistic, that cannot be courage. And the final disposition that is sometimes misunderstood as courage, or is sometimes associated with courage but wrongly so, is to be ignorant. Now this is close to the optimistic guy, because the optimistic guy also had an element of ignorance in how he arrived at his actions. But the ignorant doesn't have the self-confidence. They just have a misapprehension that makes them stand firm. So they display this correct attitude to fear, but because they didn't understand something correctly. Once this misapprehension is corrected, you would expect them to run. As soon as they discover the truth, they no longer appear courageous. That is because they were not really courageous. What motivated them was their ignorance. Okay, and he finishes just by a small last point. Courage is generally more related to fearful things and the endurance of pain than the display of confidence. We should expect that. He's told us already that some vices appear to be more related to their virtue than others. And nonetheless, he says, when you experience this kind of pain in the process of being virtuous, it's a different sort of situation. Have a think about a boxer, okay? A boxer who's in the ring and takes punches, feels all the pain of those punches. It is not that because he's a good boxer, he doesn't feel the pain of that pleasure, but he's a good boxer because he focuses on the honor of winning the match. It is the end, which is a noble end, that motivates him to put up with the pain and the misfortunes of what is happening in the exercise of his skill of boxing. So the same kind of thing can happen to the courageous person. Courage can be associated with pain and misfortune because there is often a difficulty involved in it. In the same way that you have to take the punches in the boxing ring, there may be metaphorical punches that you need to take in the exercise of courage. But what makes this acceptable is the fact that you're aiming at the good that courage is aiming at, in the same way that the boxer is aiming at the honors of winning. So the experience of being courageous may involve pain and suffering, and maybe a negative one, even though the achievement of the end of courage is always positive and always associated with eudaimonia and flourishing. Remember when we talked about eudaimonia and flourishing, we said that eudaimonia is a very difficult concept to translate. It doesn't necessarily translate as immediate happiness. And here we have an example. So the courageous person could, and this is quite a realistic picture of what courage actually is, could be experiencing all sorts of pains and sufferings in the exercise of her courage, but still her eudaimonia remains unaffected because she's always aiming at the noble and the good. It's the recognition of courage as a virtue being motivated by seeing the end as the noble and the good. Okay, we're going to stop there because next thing he discusses temperance, and this is a virtue associated with pleasures, and we'll talk about that next time.